Nobody in Redstone Creek Valley could say exactly when the laughter started. It may have been a Tuesday morning in early June when Gideon Falk stepped out of his general store coffee cup, steaming in his hand, and squinted up at the eastern ridge. Something was catching the light up there, glinting in the summer sun, like scattered coins on a rooftop. He stared for a moment. Then he smiled. Then he called out to Tom Briggs, standing nearby, and Tom looked up and smiled too. And within 2 minutes, the laughter had spread down the length of the main street like a match touched a dry straw. What they were laughing at was this Loretta Moreland, the widow up on the ridge, was laying apple slices across a canvas sheet on her roof. Dozens of them. Each one placed with a careful, deliberate hand catching the full heat of the Colorado summer sun. Gold and pale and perfectly spaced, they shone from the hilltop like something that had no business being there. Who dries food in June? Who does that on a day when children are splashing in Redstone Creek and gardens are pushing up green through black soil and the world smells like pine and warmth and ease? The answer the men on that street agreed upon quietly and with satisfaction was simple. A woman who had lost her mind, a woman broken open by grief. A woman who had been alone too long on that ridge with nothing but her memories and her silence. They were wrong on every count, but they would not know that until the snow came. Up on the ridge, Loretta heard the laughter rise on the wind. She did not turn around. She was placing the 73rd apple slice into position one handspan from the 72nd, precisely enough space for air to move beneath the edges without the corners curling before the surface had time to dry. This was not knowledge she had learned from a book. It was knowledge earned in the winter of 1883, when she had watched improperly dried meat develop green mold within 2 weeks and realized there was nothing left after that to feed her children. Her hand moved steadily. After the apple slice came the notebook. Small brown leather cover spine worn soft from 4 years of daily use. She wrote June 7th. Temperature estimated 82 degrees. Southeast wind light. Fourth apple batch, 73 slices. Expected full dry in 4 days, assuming no overnight dew. Below her, the laughter continued. Loretta looked at the number 73, then looked across the yard that stretched below the cabin's south face. 3 rows of wooden drying racks stood between the ponderosa pines, hung with thin strips of venison that had been salting since the week before, the surface of each strip tightening in the mountain air. A half-dozen trout from Redstone Creek hung open on a cord split and splayed their silver skins, going hard in the breeze. Bundles of rosemary and sage and mountain mint hung from the porch eave in thick clusters. At the far end of the yard, 12 large glass jars waited to be filled when the next batch of tomatoes ripened enough to be worth the cutting. None of this was madness. Every piece of it was the execution of a plan 4 years in the making. She added to the notebook salt remaining 47 pounds. Minimum 30 more required before September. Speak to Gideon about next order. Then she set the pencil down and looked up at the clear sky above the Rocky Mountains. No clouds. But the barn swallows had gone south 2 weeks earlier than any year she could remember. And that morning before first light, she had watched a ground squirrel make 15 trips between 2 pine trees in less time than it should have taken to make 5, moving with the frantic energy of a creature that feels something in the ground that human feet cannot. She did not mention this to anyone. No one asked. Loretta Moreland came into her 42nd year that summer with gray at both temples that she made no effort to conceal, hands roughened and scarred from labor that most men in the valley hired out, and a way of moving through the world that was deliberate and unhurried. The gait of someone who knows exactly where she is going and has already considered what will be required when she gets there. She was not a woman who explained herself. She did not ask permission. She did not soften her edges for the comfort of people who had not earned the right to her warmth. The people of Redstone Creek called her the widow on the ridge, not with cruelty exactly, but with the comfortable dismissal people apply to those they have decided not to understand. Alonzo Moreland had died in 1883. Both sons had died in that same winter. Since then, Loretta had lived alone on the eastern ridge, beholden to no one, complaining to no one, and doing the thing that unsettled people most of all. She did not appear to need their sympathy. A widow who did not need sympathy was a widow who made people feel strange about themselves. It was easier to laugh. The winter of 1883 did not come to Loretta in sequence. It came in fragments, sharp-edged, arriving without announcement in the middle of ordinary moments. The smell of wood ash when she swept the firebox in the morning would bring back the sight of Alonzo's kitchen table, the one he had sanded smooth across 3 evenings, while the boys watched from their beds burning in the fireplace because there was nothing else left to burn. The sound of wind through the window seam on December nights would bring back the sound of DeWitt's breathing, changing in pitch around the 12th day, going short and shallow, in a way she had not known was a sound she would carry forever. But the sharpest fragment, the one she had never learned to absorb, was the voice of Jasper. Jasper had been 7 years old, the most stubborn child she had ever known, and she meant that as the closest thing to a compliment she knew how to give. He had taught himself to tie his own boots at 3 because he refused to ask for help. He asked more questions in a single afternoon than most men asked in a week. He was the child who on the day DeWitt died had lain still through an entire afternoon and then turned to look at Loretta with eyes wider than usual and said quietly, "I am sorry. I should have protected him." 7 years old, and he had apologized. She had not known what to say. She had held him instead, and one day after that, Jasper had followed his brother. The night Alonzo died, Loretta did not cry. She sat without moving beside a fire that was nearly out, holding one of DeWitt's small shoes in both hands, staring at the coals going gray without seeing them. There was no plan in her, no thought, only the thick darkness behind open eyes and the particular silence of a house where the sounds you expected had stopped. This was the only moment in 4 years that Loretta Moreland was completely, entirely not herself. She did not know how long she sat there. The fire went fully out. The room became dark enough that she could not see her own hands. Outside, snow continued to fall, quiet and indifferent, knowing nothing and caring nothing about what it had taken. Then from the back room came a sound, a small, dry cough. Jasper. Loretta stood up, not because the pain had ended. The pain had not ended and would not end, and she had already understood that much. She stood up because pain is not a reason to sit in the dark when there is still a child in the next room who needs warmth. She picked up the last piece of Alonzo's reading chair, the one he had sat in each evening with a cup of tea and whatever book he was working through that season, and she put it in the fireplace. The fire caught. Light came back into the room. That was the only decision she made that night. It was enough. In the spring of 1884, when the snow thinned enough to push the door open, Loretta dug 3 graves by hand in ground that was still half frozen. Her fingers bled through the first grave. She wrapped them in cloth torn from an old shirt and kept going. By the 3rd grave, the damage was worse, a deep tear across the palm of her right hand running from the base of her index finger to her wrist. She did not stop. When it was done, she stood before the 3 small mounds with her right hand wrapped in blood-soaked cloth and looked up at the silent snow-covered mountains surrounding the valley. She did not pray in the way people expected. She did not weep, not there, not in front of those mountains that had watched it all and said nothing. She said quietly and clearly into the cold air, "Never again." Not a promise to God or to Alonzo or to anyone with a name. A promise to the ground, to the cold, to the indifferent thing that had taken everything she loved and would try again if she allowed it. From that day forward, Loretta Moreland began to learn everything she could find about keeping food through a mountain winter. She read old farming almanacs and settler letters from the Great Plains and the handwritten journals of trappers who had spent decades in the high country. She tested methods and recorded results and corrected failures. She watched the natural world with the attention of someone who understands that nature does not lie. It only speaks to those who are willing to listen without assuming they already know the answer. The scar across her right palm never fully faded. She did not want it to. By the summer of 1887, the yard below Loretta's cabin had become what a stranger seeing it for the first time might have called extraordinary, and what the people of Redstone Creek called disturbing. The drying racks extended in 3 long rows. The smokehouse at the back of the property held row upon row of salted and smoked venison. Root vegetables were stored in a cellar lined with dry straw. The shelves along the south wall of the cabin held sealed glass jars catching the light in pale amber and deep red. And every pound of every provision was recorded in the brown leather notebook, in Loretta's precise small handwriting, cross-referenced against estimated consumption rates for one person across 7 months of potential isolation. She bought more salt than any family in the valley. No coffee, no sugar, no luxury flour. Only what preserved. Gideon Falk made it a regular piece of entertainment. He would note it for customers in the tone of a man sharing something both amusing and mildly alarming. And the customers would shake their heads and laugh because laughing was far more comfortable than the alternative, which was asking themselves whether they were as prepared as she was. They were not asking themselves that question. Not yet. The morning at the water well happened on a Wednesday in late July, which was when Harriet Briggs chose to make her comment. Harriet was 35, a wife of Griffith Briggs, who built the best furniture in the valley, a woman whose appearance was always composed, and whose sense of her own standing in the community was precise and carefully maintained. She was not a cruel person in the way people sometimes are with intention and satisfaction. She was the kind who says cutting things in public because it keeps her in the middle of the circle, because the circle feels safer than the edge, and because the widow on the ridge made her feel without doing anything at all, like she was standing too close to something she could not name. 5 women were gathered at the well that morning. Loretta was pulling up her bucket, not talking, focused on the rope in her hands. Harriet waited until the moment was right, the way people do when they have been composing a line in their head, and then she said it loud enough for all 5 women to hear. "Mrs. Moreland, I heard you are up there curing your dead husband on the roof." Laughter, the small, nervous kind that follows when someone says the thing everyone was thinking, but no one had said yet. Loretta set the bucket down on the stone rim. She turned and looked at Harriet Briggs. Not the look of a woman who has been wounded. Not the look of a woman who is preparing a response. The look of a woman who is noting something carefully, storing it away, filing it in the part of her mind that records facts about the world she lives in. She held Harriet's gaze long enough that the laughter around them thinned and then stopped. Then she picked up her bucket and walked away without a word. Harriet had been prepared to receive a reaction. Anger or hurt, or the brittle dignity of a woman pretending not to be hurt. She had not been prepared for the absence of reaction, and the absence turned out to be worse. It stayed with her longer than an argument would have. Behind Harriet's back, her daughter Ottilie stood watching Loretta walk toward the ridge road. Ottilie was 7 years old with a brown ponytail and the kind of alert, observational stillness that children sometimes have before the world teaches them that paying close attention to things is strange. She watched Loretta until the figure disappeared around the first bend of the hill road. She did not laugh. She had not laughed at the well, and she would not have been able to say exactly why. Reverend Obadiah Crane arrived on a Thursday afternoon with the manner of a man who considered himself a careful, measured person, which he was, and a man who had the best interests of his community at heart, which was also true. He was 58, gray-bearded, with a voice like old timber, warm and dense and slow. He knocked politely on Loretta's cabin door and stepped inside when she opened it without waiting to be asked, because he had been walking into people's homes for 30 years and had stopped noticing the presumption. He looked around the cabin kitchen with the careful eyes of a man cataloging what he sees. The shelves of jars, the hanging herbs, the notebook open on the table, the general atmosphere of a space organized by a mind that was working through a problem rather than living in a home. Mrs. Moreland, he said, sitting down in the chair. She indicated without asking whether he might sit. I have come as someone who is concerned for your welfare. I hear you, Reverend, she said, and continued arranging the clean jars on the shelf. I understand you have been, he paused, searching for the correct phrasing, quite extensively, preparing for the winter this year. I have, to a degree that some in the valley find unsettling. They feel it is creating anxiety, a kind of fear that spreads that doesn't serve the community well. Loretta set down the jar she was holding and turned to look at him. I do not talk to anyone in the valley about the winter. No, but your actions speak, and he paused again. There is something I want to say carefully. Reverend Crane believed in saying difficult things carefully as a mark of respect, both to the person being addressed and to the truth itself. God provides for those who trust in him, Mrs. Moreland. Excessive worry, the kind that becomes its own occupation, can be a sign of insufficient faith. Loretta looked at him for a long time. He was a man of genuine conviction, and she did not mistake that. He believed what he was saying, and that was the most important thing to know about a person who was about to tell you that you were wrong. You may be right, Reverend, she said. God sends the rain, but the farmer still digs the irrigation ditch. The kitchen was quiet. Outside wind moved through the pines. Crane sat for a moment longer the way a man does when he came prepared for one kind of conversation and has found himself in a different one. Then he stood, adjusted his collar with a small, unconscious gesture of a man collecting himself, and left with a smile that was not quite what it had been when he arrived. Loretta watched him go until the tree line swallowed his dark coat. Then she turned back to the notebook and wrote beneath a column of supply figures, Reverend Crane. Community concern. Does not understand. Not yet. 2 days after Crane, Judge Crispin Stowe came to the ridge for the third time. Loretta had known he would come, not because she possessed any particular gift for prediction, but because she had been watching Crispin Stowe for 2 years and she understood his patterns. He was a man who moved in steps, always 3 steps to a goal, always with increasing pressure at each stage, always with the same underlying patience of someone who believes time is working in his favor. The first visit had been an inquiry. The second had been an offer. The third would be something closer to a statement. Stowe was 55, silver-streaked hair, brushed back from a broad forehead, always in a dark suit, regardless of the mud and the mountain dust around him. He was the most powerful man in Redstone Creek Valley, not by title but by leverage, holding enough mortgages and land contracts to make life difficult for anyone he chose to make it difficult for. He had not chosen that with Loretta, not yet, because Loretta owned her land outright. Alonzo had paid cash in 1879, and there was no paper with Stowe's seal on it anywhere in the cabin. That was the problem from Stowe's perspective, and the problem had a solution if she would only be reasonable about it. He stopped in the middle of the yard and looked around at the drying racks in the smokehouse and the hanging fish with the expression of a man performing assessment, his gray eyes moving quickly, measuring things she could feel him measuring even from the porch. Mrs. Moreland, he said, his voice carrying the particular warmth of someone practiced at sounding sincere. You are well, I hope. Mr. Stowe, what is it you want? He smiled. Not offended, never offended, because offense required caring what the other person thought, and Stowe had moved past that. He stepped closer. I have an offer regarding this property. No, you haven't heard the figure. I heard the last 2 figures. The answer has not changed. Stowe let the silence stretch for a moment. Then he looked past her shoulder at the cabin itself, at the solid stone chimney and the small windows that looked out over the whole valley below, and his expression shifted slightly into something that was not quite regret. A woman alone on a ridge like this, he said, it cannot go on indefinitely. I have been here 4 years. You have been fortunate, he said, and he let the words sit for a moment before adding so far. He turned and walked back down the hill path with an even, unhurried step, the step of a man who has made his point and is content to let it work. Loretta watched him until he was gone. Then she opened the notebook and wrote beneath the supply column in the same small, precise hand she used for everything CS. Third visit. Next time will not be words. What she did not tell him was that she had been in Gideon's store 2 days earlier, standing behind a row of flour barrels at the back of the shop when Stowe had stood at the counter speaking to Gideon in a voice lower than he believed necessary. The Ridgeland has the best underground water source in this valley, Gideon. Whoever controls that water controls the whole valley. Gideon had nodded the way a man nods when a powerful person says something to him in confidence, with the slightly flattered expression of someone who has been included in something important. And Stowe had walked out, adjusted his cuffs, and climbed the ridge road to make Loretta his third offer. She had taken the short trail up and arrived at the cabin before him. She had been arranging jars when he knocked. She had not told him she knew. There was no reason to, not yet. Information held in reserve is information that retains its power. In July, the wind changed. Not dramatically. Not in the way anyone standing on a street corner would have commented upon. It happened in the early mornings, a slight shift in the air coming down from the northern peaks, carrying something cold that had no business being in a July wind. Not biting cold, not winter cold yet. More the way a room feels different when a door at the far end has been opened even before the cold air reaches you. A reminder, a foretelling. Loretta stood on the porch 3 mornings in a row, feeling it, and each morning she went back inside and sat at the table and calculated a more conservative estimate for how much food she would need before the first hard freeze. Below in the valley, men were debating which team would win the fall shooting competition. Fletcher Aldous was proclaiming it would be him for the 3rd year running. Gideon Falk was opening a new bottle of whiskey. Someone made a joke about the widow on the ridge, and the laughter rolled out of the open windows of the saloon and up the hill on the same breeze that Loretta was standing in. No one looked at the direction the wind was coming from. September arrived with rain, not the moderate rain of autumn that freshens the air and turns the aspens before the first frost. This was persistent, heavy rain that fell as though the sky was settling, a long debt cloud sitting on the mountain peaks and refusing to lift. 3 days became a week, became 2 weeks, became 3. The Western Pass Road, the only road connecting Redstone Creek to the outside world, began to go soft. Wagon ruts deepened from 6 inches to a foot. The supply convoy scheduled for September 12th did not appear. People began to be mildly concerned. Gideon Falk checked his inventory. Fletcher Aldous asked someone about the condition of the pass. Reverend Crane told his congregation that the rain would break. In the back of Gideon's store on a quiet afternoon, Dr. Emmett Mercer was standing at the medicine counter with a deliberate, measured manner, placing 3 bottles of quinine into his supply bag. Mercer was 50 years old, thin, with wire-rimmed glasses and the unhurried movements of a man accustomed to making decisions carefully. He added bandaging, a bottle of carbolic, thought about it, added 2 more quinine bottles. He did not hear Loretta come in until she was standing beside him. She placed a 20-pound sack of salt on the counter with both hands. Her 4th order this month, her eyes moved to his supply bag. With the frank, unguarded interest she gave everything she observed. "Dr. Mercer," she said. He turned. "Mrs. Moreland." He kept his voice neutral, the voice he used when he was waiting to understand a situation before he formed an opinion of it. He was a man who tried very hard not to form opinions before he had sufficient information, which meant he had fewer of them than most people, but trusted them more when they arrived. "What are you preparing for?" Loretta looked at the bag in his hands. Then she looked up at his face. "The same thing you are preparing for with those bottles." Mercer looked down at his own hands. 5 bottles of quinine. He stood with that for a moment, feeling the discomfort of being accurately read by someone he had not expected to read him. He said nothing more. But when Loretta left with her salt sack over one shoulder, he stood for a long moment looking after her, and then he turned back to the medicine shelf and added 2 more rolls of bandaging to the bag. For the first time that summer, Emmett Mercer was genuinely worried. The night the mountain moved was the 19th of September. Loretta heard it before she saw it. A sound that came from deep in the rock, low and weighted and fundamental. Nothing like thunder. Thunder came from above. This sound came from inside the mountain itself, the way a ship's hull sounds when it is taking on water in the dark, a slow and irrevocable settling. She was out of bed before she had finished deciding to be. She pulled on her coat and her boots and walked to the porch. Rain was falling hard in the darkness. Lightning moved across the clouds in slow pulses rather than strikes. And in one long flash that split the sky from north to south, Loretta saw it. The western face of the ridge, the long sloping wall of rock and packed earth along which the pass road wound for 2 miles was moving. Not the sudden violence of what people imagined when they thought about landslides. It was slow and inexorable, the movement of something that had been holding on for a long time and had made a final decision. Trees snapped with sounds like rifle shots, sharp and then gone. Rock moved in slow cascades, one group pulling the next. And then the entire upper section of the ridge face released and came down in a dark wave that buried the road below, under a mass of earth and broken timber that would not be measured properly until morning. The sound when it landed was not loud. It was deep and final, the way a door sounds when it is closed for the last time and the latch catches. Then the rain resumed as if nothing had interrupted it. Loretta stood on the porch with her hand on the support post, feeling the wet wood under her palm, looking out at the place where the road used to be. Her hair was soaked through. Water ran from the brim of her hat and dripped from her chin. She was not afraid. She understood exactly what had happened. No wagons, no flour, no additional salt, no supply line, no way out, and no way in, until a crew could clear that pass, and a crew of that size in winter conditions could not clear it before the first heavy snow, which could come in October or as late as November, and there was no way to know which. She had spent 4 years preparing for this. She turned and went inside. She lit the oil lamp. She opened the notebook to a fresh page, and she began to calculate. In the valley below, at Abner Cobb's saloon on the main street, Fletcher Aldous was sitting with 3 other men around a pine table when the sound reached them through the window, a deep rolling vibration that shook the glass slightly in its frame. He set down his glass. "That is not thunder," he said. He walked to the door and looked out into the rain. The mountains to the west were dark, and the low clouds obscured everything above the tree line. He stood there for a moment listening, but the sound had stopped, and the rain was steady and even, and told him nothing. Someone behind him said something about the weather. Someone else poured more whiskey. Fletcher stood at the door for a few seconds longer. A big man with his hand on the frame, looking out at the mountains he had looked at every day of his life without ever quite believing they had intentions. Then he came back inside. He did not know that the sound he had heard was the valley's only road disappearing. By morning, everyone knew. Dewey Nesbitt had gone out at first light to check the pass and came back gray-faced with news that left the main street very quiet for the first time anyone could remember. The road was gone. Not blocked, not obstructed. Gone. A wall of earth and shattered timber, 10 feet high and hundreds of feet wide, had replaced it. No crew without heavy equipment in weeks of labor could open that again. And the first snow of the season could come any day. Reverend Crane rang the church bell and called the community together. He stood at the front of his congregation and spoke about faith and resilience in the history of people who had endured worse. He spoke steadily and with genuine belief in what he was saying because he was that kind of man. But midway through his remarks, Fletcher Aldous stood up. He did not raise his hand or excuse himself. He simply stood, a large man in a small church, and he looked around the room at his neighbors, and he asked the question that cut through everything else in the way that simple, direct questions sometimes do. How much food do we have? The silence that followed was long enough to mean something. People looked at each other. Gideon Falk was running numbers in his head, and the expression on his face was not reassuring. Harriet Briggs began to cry not from fear exactly, but from the sudden recognition that she did not know the answer to a question she should have known the answer to, that the answer mattered and she had never thought to find it before this moment. In the back corner of the church, Emmett Mercer sat with a small notebook on his knee. He had done the calculation the night before. He closed the notebook now and said nothing because there was nothing useful to say yet, and because one of the things he had learned across 30 years of medicine was that the moment between knowing a hard thing and saying it out loud was sometimes worth preserving for just a little longer. On the eastern ridge above them, the oil lamp in Loretta Moreland's cabin was still burning. She sat at the table with the notebook open, running her pencil down columns of numbers she had been building for 4 years, checking them against new variables and revised assumptions. She looked up once at the shelves of sealed jars, their contents visible through the glass in shades of red and amber and pale gold, enough to sustain one person through a hard winter, and perhaps with careful management, considerably more than one. She had spent 4 years on a ridge being laughed at. She had bought salt when others bought sugar. She had dried apple slices on her roof in the June sun, while the men below made jokes about it at the general store. She had listened to a reverend tell her she lacked faith and a judge tell her she was fortunate to have survived this long, and she had listened to a woman at the well make a comment that was meant to diminish her, and she had walked away from all of it and come back up here and kept working. And now the road was gone and the valley was cut off, and the people below were sitting in a church not knowing the answer to the most important question any of them had ever been asked. She was not glad about what had happened. She had not wanted the mountain to move. She had not wanted any of this. But for the first time in 4 years, standing alone in this cabin with everything she had built around her, Loretta Moreland did not feel like the woman the valley had decided she was. She did not feel like the mad widow on the ridge, the woman who dried apples in the summer and talked to nobody and asked no one for help and gave no one the satisfaction of her grief. She felt ready, and then came the knock at the door. 3 times. Soft, weak, nearly swallowed by the wind and the last of the rain outside. Loretta set down her pencil. She looked at the door for a moment. Then she stood, reached for the Winchester in the corner, and walked across the room to see who had come to find her in the dark. The boy on the porch weighed less than a bale of wet hay. Loretta could see that before she opened the door all the way. She had been standing with the Winchester at her side, listening through the wood, counting the silence between his knocks and measuring what it told her. One person, young. The breathing was shallow and coming too fast, the kind of breathing that means the body is working harder than it should have just to stay upright. Not a threat, something worse than a threat, something she recognized. She opened the door and the lamplight fell across him. He was 16, though he looked younger because hunger takes years off a person in the wrong direction, stripping away the substance that age is supposed to add. His coat hung from his shoulders the way a coat hangs on a fence post. His cheekbones pushed against pale skin. His breath came out in small, white bursts that vanished in the cold air before they finished forming. "Please," he said, "just a piece of bread." His name was Rockwell Pickett. Loretta had known that name for years. Everyone in Redstone Creek knew the Pickett family, though knowing them meant something different from knowing the Aldises or the Briggses. Aldous Pickett had been a capable man, once a man who could fix a wagon wheel or frame a wall with equal skill. Then Rockwell's mother had died of fever 2 winters back, and Aldous had crawled into a bottle and pulled the opening in after him. The boy had been surviving on the margins of a household that had stopped being one. Loretta stood in the doorway and looked at Rockwell's hands. They were shaking, and not from cold alone. She stepped aside without a word. He came through the threshold and went down before he reached the fireplace. Not a collapse with noise or drama, just a slow, inevitable lowering like a tree that has been standing on compromised roots and finally accepts what was always coming. She caught him under the arm and kept his head from hitting the floorboards, and then she got him the rest of the way to the hearthrug and put blankets over him and set a pot of water on the stove. She did not ask his name again. She already knew it. She did not ask how long since he had eaten or how far he had walked in the rain. The answers were written on him plainly enough. When Rockwell woke, the fire was high, and the cabin smelled of broth and dried herbs and something sweet underneath that he could not immediately identify. He lay still for a moment with the ceiling above him, wondering if this was what it felt like to be dead. And then he heard her moving and turned his head and saw Loretta Moreland sitting across the room at a table writing in a small notebook by the light of an oil lamp, completely uninterested in the dramatic fact of his survival. "You were close," she said without looking up. "Another night outside and you would not have woken up." She brought him broth in a wooden bowl and told him to drink it slowly, and he obeyed because there was something in her voice that did not invite discussion, not unkind but absolute. The voice of someone who has considered the situation and arrived at a conclusion and would prefer not to have that conclusion debated. He drank slowly. The warmth moved through him in stages like light coming into a room as clouds shift. "I am not a charity," she said when the bowl was half empty. She was sitting across from him now, watching him with the same focused attention she gave to everything. "If you stay, you work. You carry water and cut wood and check the traps at the creek. You do not steal. You do not tell anyone what is in this cabin." He nodded. "If trouble comes," she said, "you stand behind me and follow my direction." He swallowed. "Yes, ma'am." That was how it began. 3 days after Rockwell arrived, his father came up the Ridge Road. Aldous Pickett was 40 years old and looked 60. He was not a bad man in the way that some men are bad with calculation and intent. He was a man who had been broken by loss and had chosen the wrong thing to fill the break with, and had been choosing it every day for 2 years until the choosing had become the whole of him. He came up the path in the morning with his coat open despite the cold and his eyes carrying the particular redness that is not from wind. He did not knock. He stopped at the edge of the yard and called out for Rockwell in a voice that was louder than the situation required, the overcompensating volume of someone who knows he is in the wrong and is trying to make noise fill the space where authority should be. Loretta came out onto the porch. Aldous looked at her with an expression that moved through several things quickly. Resentment at having to look up at her on the porch. Awareness that she was a woman who did not find him impressive. Something underneath both of those things that was closer to shame, though he would not have named it that. "I want my boy," he said. Loretta looked at him for a moment. Then she called into the cabin, and Rockwell appeared in the doorway behind her, standing just inside the threshold, looking at his father with a face that had gone carefully still. "You can take him," Loretta said. "But first you give me what you have in your inside coat pocket." Aldous went rigid. The coat bulged slightly on the left side, the particular shape of a bottle carried against the chest for warmth. Loretta had seen it the moment he walked into the yard. Aldous looked at Rockwell. The boy said nothing. He stood in the doorway and watched his father with the still face of someone who has watched this scene play out in many different forms and knows how it ends. The silence in the yard stretched. A jay called from the tree line and went quiet. Aldous Pickett turned around and walked back down the Ridge Road without his son. He did not look back. His hand went briefly to the outside of his coat, pressing against the shape on the left side, and then dropped. Loretta watched him go until the road bent and he was gone. Then she looked back at Rockwell, still standing in the doorway. The boy's face had not changed, but something in his eyes had a small quiet, closing the way a room looks when the last light in it goes out. He had understood what his father had just chosen. He stepped back inside and went to stack the morning's wood without being asked, and Loretta let him, because there are things a person needs to do with their hands when there is nothing useful to do with what they are feeling. Within 3 weeks of the landslide, 12 children had come to the ridge. They came in ones and twos, some brought by parents who stood at the yard's edge with the particular expression of adults who have run out of other options and are experiencing that running out as a physical sensation in the chest. Others came alone, having decided on their own or been sent without full explanation. Each child who arrived found a cabin that smelled of wood smoke and salt and dried fruit, and something that took a moment to identify order them. Deliberate, structured order of a space that was being managed rather than merely inhabited. Loretta's rule was unchanged. Children stayed. Adults brought firewood, 1 load per child per day, and collected their children at an hour Loretta specified, not before and not after. It was not a negotiation, and she did not present it as one. 14 children in a 2-room cabin required a different kind of management than one woman and a 16-year-old boy. Loretta ran it the way she ran her supply inventory, with complete attention to resource and efficiency and zero tolerance for waste. Meals were measured to the gram. The older children worked from the time the fire was lit until the early dark, cutting and stacking and hauling and learning the particular discipline of labor that has a purpose. The younger ones swept and sorted and carried small loads and were kept busy because idle children in close quarters in cold weather are a problem of a different kind. Rockwell moved through all of it with a quiet competence that surprised no one more than himself. He had come to the cabin hollow and shaking and had been filled back up not just with food but with structure, with the experience of being relied upon for something specific, and that turned out to matter more than he had known anything could matter. Among the 14 was Ottilie Briggs. She had not been brought. She had come on her own in the early evening of a gray day, with her coat buttoned to the throat and her chin set, and told Loretta, directly standing on the porch with her hands at her sides, that her mother did not know she was here. Loretta looked at this child for a long moment. Harriet Briggs' daughter, the woman who had made the comment at the well, who had performed her small cruelty for an audience of 5 and not anticipated what it would cost her. The daughter who had not laughed. Loretta stepped aside and let her in. Harriet came up the ridge 2 days later. She arrived in the late afternoon with the face of a woman who had been preparing her argument the whole climb up and was ready to deliver it with the full weight of maternal authority. She was going to be firm. She was going to be clear. She was going to take her daughter home and make it understood that this arrangement was not acceptable. Loretta opened the door when she knocked. Harriet said she had come for Ottilie. Loretta called the girl to the door without comment or expression. Ottilie came and stood between them, looking first at her mother, then at Loretta, then at her mother again. The space between the two women felt like the moment before weather changes, charged and pressurized and waiting. "I want to stay," Ottilie said. 3 words delivered with the same quiet directness she had brought to the porch 2 days earlier. No performance in them. Just a statement of true preference from a child who had decided to be honest, even though honesty was the harder choice. Harriet Briggs looked past her daughter into the interior of the cabin and saw what was there. A fire burning high and steady, 14 children in various states of quiet industry, older ones stacking wood, younger ones sorting dried beans into bowls, all of them with color in their faces that she had not seen in the children she had passed on the main street recently. Order without harshness, warmth without indulgence. She looked at Loretta over her daughter's head. Loretta said nothing. She had made her point simply by opening the door, and she understood that adding to it would only give Harriet something to push against. Harriet left without Ottilie. She walked back down the ridge road, and Loretta did not watch her go because there was no need to watch. She already knew what Harriet had seen. The next morning, before the children were up, Loretta found a small cloth bundle on the porch step. Inside was half a pound of salted butter and a roll of wool fabric. No note, no name. It was enough. Harriet Briggs had learned something on the ridge that afternoon, and she had answered it in the only language that was available to her, not with words but with an offering, and Loretta accepted it in the same spirit, without comment and without keeping score. Reverend Prayne came up 2 weeks after the landslide, ostensibly to check on the children, which was true enough on its face. He arrived in the early afternoon and stood in the yard for a moment before coming to the door, taking in the drying racks, the woodpile, the orderly rhythm of the place. He had the look of a man who is revising something. Loretta gave him tea and did not say much and let him look at what he needed to look at. He watched the children for a while. He watched Rockwell moving from task to task with his quiet, unshowy efficiency. He watched Ottilie sitting with two younger children near the fire, speaking to them in a low voice, with her hands folded in her lap, the specific posture of someone who has been watched over carefully and has learned how to do the same for others. Before he left, Crane stood for a moment with his back to Loretta, looking out through the small window at the ridge line. I was wrong, he said, about the irrigation ditch. He did not add anything. He put on his hat and walked back down the hill. Loretta looked at this door for a moment after he closed it. Then she picked up her pencil and opened the notebook. But she did not write anything in it. She just sat with the pencil in her hand for a moment and then set it down again. Some things did not need to be recorded. Rockwell found the tracks on a morning in the second week of January. He had taken two of the older children to check the ice traps at the creek traps Loretta had set under the frozen surface to catch what was still moving in the slow, cold water below. It was work he had done a dozen times by now, quiet and methodical, the three of them moving through the ice fog that rolled between the trees and low gray waves, visibility perhaps 10 feet in any direction. He almost missed them. The tracks were partly filled in from overnight, cold, shallow impressions in the packed snow at the creek's edge on the far bank where the willows grew thick. He stopped and looked at them without speaking for a moment, because he had learned from Loretta that the first response to something unexpected should be observation, not reaction. Two sets, large boots, adult men, both sets circling away from the water and then back toward it from different angles. Not hunting tracks. Hunters move in one direction. These moved in a pattern, coming and going, the pattern of men watching a fixed point from multiple positions. They had been watching the traps, which meant they had been watching anyone who came to check them. Rockwell got the children back to the cabin without telling them what he had seen. He reported to Loretta the way he reported everything now, quietly and with the specific facts in the order they occurred without interpretation, unless she asked for it. She listened. Then she asked how many. At least two, he said. She went to the window and looked out at the tree line for a long moment without speaking. That evening, she set steel traps in a half circle around the cabin's perimeter, positioned well inside the tree line on the approach paths buried under thin layers of fresh snow, and she did it herself in the dark after the children were asleep. 3 days later, Reverend Crane returned to the ridge with news that had come down from the far end of the valley. Two men had been seen moving through the trees at the western edge of the property, claims men no one recognized with certainty, but several people believed were the Voss brothers, Harlan and Wendell, two men who had drifted into Redstone Creek the previous spring and departed the previous summer under circumstances that no one had fully explained, but everyone had formed opinions about. Dr. Mercer came up the ridge that same afternoon, the first time he had come uninvited. He was direct about it. He said he had heard about the tracks at the creek, and he wanted to say something that he had been thinking about since the landslide. Mrs. Moreland, he said, standing in the middle of the cabin kitchen, with his hat in his hands, if you trap men on your property and they die in those traps, you will be treated as a killer. There is no court operating in this valley right now. That is exactly the problem. Justice in a vacuum does not favor widows on ridges. It favors men with friends. Loretta looked at him across the table. Dr. Mercer had very specific, careful gray eyes behind his wire-rimmed glasses, the eyes of someone who weighs words before he spends them. You may be right, she said. Then she said, what do you need from me? He paused, surprised by the question. Nothing, he said slowly. I came to warn you. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, that is not why you came. He stood with that for a beat too long. No, he said finally. I suppose it is not. I came because I have been watching this valley for 4 months, and I have been watching you for 4 years, and I want to know what I can do that is actually useful. Loretta was quiet for a moment. Then she told him. She needed him to keep notes. Specific notes dated and witnessed about what he observed. Medical observations, physical observations, anything that might constitute documentation if it was ever needed. She needed someone with professional standing to create a record while she was busy keeping everyone alive. Mercer looked at her for a long moment. Then he opened his coat, took out the small notebook he kept in his breast pocket, and wrote the date at the top of a fresh page. They did not shake hands. They did not make speeches. They simply had an agreement. Prentice Tanner died on the 14th of January. He was 9 years old. He had been one of the first to arrive at the cabin, a quiet boy who worked without complaint and had developed over the weeks a habit of sitting near Rockwell in the evenings in a way that was clearly about more than proximity to the fire. He had a brother back in the valley and parents who brought his firewood allotment without fail and always stood a little longer than necessary at the yard gate before turning back down the hill. The morning was still and white, the ice fog thicker than usual, the trees reduced to dark shapes at close range. Rockwell had taken Prentice and a boy named Silas, who was 11, to check the creek traps. They had done it many times. The route was familiar enough that they moved on it with the comfortable half-attention of routine. The man was behind the willow screen on the far bank, and they did not see him. The shot came without warning, and in the fog it came from everywhere and nowhere at once, a concussive sound that had no visible source. Prentice went down before he could have understood what was happening to him, and Rockwell caught him by the back of the coat, and they went down together into the snow. Rockwell's hand finding the wound and pressing hard against the spreading warmth in the wool. "It hurts," Prentice said. His voice was the voice of a child reporting a fact, confused rather than terrified, still waiting for someone to explain what had happened. Rockwell told him to hold on. He said it with the conviction of someone who has been told by circumstances that conviction might be enough. He held the pressure with both hands and told Prentice to keep his eyes open and began the slow, careful movement back toward the tree line. Prentice kept his eyes open for 11 minutes. When they reached the cabin, Rockwell's coat was dark to the elbow. Loretta came off the porch before they were through the gate, and she took Prentice from Rockwell's arms without a word, and she carried him inside, and she laid him on the hearth rug that Rockwell had lain on in September. And she knew from the moment she touched him that the hands pressing the wound and the long walk through the cold had not been enough. She closed his eyes with her fingers gently, and she held the stillness in herself the way she had learned to hold it, the way you hold a thing that will break everything if you let it move. She looked up at Rockwell, who was standing in the middle of the room with his bloody hands at his sides, staring at the boy on the rug with the expression of someone who has just learned something irreversible about the world. She said nothing. There was nothing that would help. That night, after Prentice was buried behind the cabin in the frozen ground, next to the 3 graves already there, and after the children were asleep under their piled blankets, and after Rockwell had finally stopped sitting vigil by the door and let exhaustion take him, Loretta sat alone beside the fire. She pressed her right hand flat against her thigh, feeling the scar across her palm, and she sat with what had happened. She had promised the mountains. She had promised herself. And the winter had taken another child from her care, not through cold and hunger this time, but through the hands of men, which was a different thing, and in some ways a worse one because it meant the threat had a face. After a long time she stood up, not because she had finished grieving, but because grief was not the next required action. She opened the notebook. At the top of a fresh page, she wrote 2 names that had come to her before midnight, names carried on the same wind that brought Reverend Crane's information and Rockwell's track report, in the particular pattern of a bullet wound that Dr. Mercer had examined on Prentice's coat by lamplight and noted in his own notebook without being asked. Harlan Voss, Wendell Voss. She wrote the names, and then she sat looking at them for a while, and then she began to plan. Dr. Mercer came up the ridge the next morning before the children were awake. He stood in the kitchen and told Loretta what he had found when he examined Prentice's coat. The entry angle of the bullet, the grouping of the fibers around the wound, the trajectory relative to the body position Rockwell had described. Short range, he said, 40 to 50 feet. Small caliber, not a hunting rifle. The kind of weapon carried by a man who wants to be able to conceal it. He paused and looked at his notebook. Then he said, I have treated both of those men before. The last time was 8 months ago. Harlan Voss had a bruised rib from a fight. Wendell Voss had a laceration on his left forearm. I noted the circumstances at the time as inconsistent with their account. I noted it because I was suspicious of them then and because I have learned over 30 years that a physician's notes are the only record that exists in places where no other record is being kept. Loretta listened to all of it. Then she said, write it down again. Today's date, what you observed on the coat, the names. He already had his pencil out. What Loretta did in the following 5 days was methodical and quiet and comprehensive. Steel traps already in place were repositioned to new locations moved after dark. The window shutters were reinforced with additional bracing cut from green pine. Rockwell practiced at the rear window with a procedure they had worked out between them: 2 shots left, then right, then a reload, and wait a pattern designed to make 2 people sound like 4. Signal words were agreed upon, sounds that would carry through a wall without meaning anything to someone who did not know what they meant. She told the children what she needed to tell them, which was enough to prepare them and not enough to frighten them beyond usefulness. If you hear the word come from outside, she told them, you go to the back room, you pull the mattresses to the floor, you stay below the window line, and you do not move until I come for you. None of the children argued. They had seen Prentice's coat. The attack came on the 23rd of January after midnight. The first sign was the orange light. Loretta smelled the kerosene before she saw the fire, and she was already moving by the time the full bloom of it became visible through the window. The smokehouse on the north side of the yard going up in a column of fire that lit the snow and the trees and the underside of the clouds all the way to the ridge line. She did not go out. Rockwell was at her shoulder in the darkness. They want us outside, he said. We stay, she said. The first shot came through the east window 30 seconds later, high and wide, taking a piece of the upper frame. Then 2 more in quick succession, lower. The children were already on the floor in the back room, already below the window line. Ottilie's voice low and counting in the dark, keeping the smaller ones focused the way Loretta had kept her focused on the walk from the well 3 months ago. Loretta moved to the west window and waited. She had learned from 4 years of hunting that patience in the dark is its own kind of weapon. She counted heartbeats. The figure came out of the trees at the northwest corner of the yard, moving toward the cabin in a low run, using the light of the burning smokehouse to navigate. She let him come inside 30 feet. Then she fired. A shout, not a death sound, a hit sound, a man who has been struck in a place that is serious, but not immediately final. She heard him go down and heard the secondary sounds of someone trying to decide whether to retreat or continue. Rockwell fired twice from the rear of the cabin, different angle, different report, the sound of a second shooter, a second shout from the tree line, lower in pitch. Then nothing for a long time. Just the fire eating the smokehouse and the orange light on the snow. They did not come again that night. Before first light, Loretta heard the sound of 2 men moving in the trees, the specific sound of men carrying something heavy between them, an uneven dragging rhythm, and then the sound diminishing as they moved north along the tree line away from the cabin. When the sky went gray, she went out into the yard. The smokehouse was ash and the stone foundation it had stood on. Weeks of smoked meat gone. She stood in front of it and looked at the foundation stones and calculated what the loss meant in terms of the months remaining and the mouths inside the cabin and the supplies on the shelves. Then Rockwell came up behind her holding something he had found in the snow at the northwest corner of the yard where she had heard the first man go down. It was a folded piece of paper, damp and partially frozen at the edges. He handed it to her without a word. Loretta unfolded it. It was a hand-drawn diagram of the cabin, surprisingly accurate, with the outbuildings marked and the approach routes indicated with lines. In the margin, in a handwriting that was careful and educated, the handwriting of someone who was accustomed to having their written words mean something, were the words, force them out. Land must be vacant before spring. At the bottom right corner, pressed into the paper with a small tool, was a wax seal. The image in the seal was a set of balance scales, the seal of Judge Crispin Stowe. Loretta stood in the cold dawn air with the paper in her hands and the ash of the smokehouse in front of her, and the sound of the children beginning to stir inside the cabin behind her. She had known on some level since the third visit, since the overheard conversation at Gideon's counter. She had written it in the notebook as a probability, a thing to plan for, a variable to account for. But a probability and a piece of physical evidence with a man's seal on it are two entirely different things, and she understood as she stood there that what she was holding had the potential to change the balance of everything. She folded the paper carefully and put it in her coat pocket. She looked at Rockwell. He was watching her with the particular attention he had developed over the months, the attention of someone who has learned that her face carries information even when she is not speaking. "Not yet," she said. He nodded. He did not ask what she was waiting for. He had learned by now that she did not withhold things without reason, and that the reason usually became clear when the time was right. Inside the cabin, Ottilie had the younger children up and moving, had stoked the fire to high. Before Loretta came back in, had the water heating on the stove. She was doing all of this with the focused, unhurried efficiency of someone who had been watching how it was done every morning for 4 months and had internalized it as her own. Loretta stopped in the doorway and looked at her for a moment. Ottilie turned from the stove, and their eyes met briefly, and then Ottilie turned back to what she was doing. Loretta hung up her coat, the paper folded in the pocket, and went to the shelf for the notebook. There were 7 weeks left until the ground might be soft enough to plant anything. 7 weeks in a burned smokehouse and 14 children and a piece of evidence that implicated the most powerful man in the valley in the death of a 9-year-old boy. That night, well after the children were asleep, someone knocked at the back door of Reverend Crane's house in the valley. Not the front door, the church door, the door a person used when they wanted to be seen coming and going. The back door. Crane opened it to find Thaddeus Dunbar standing on the step, thin, and shaking his hat held in both hands in front of him like a man approaching a confessional. Thaddeus Dunbar was Stowe's man of business, the person who ran errands and kept accounts and knew more about the judge's affairs than anyone in the valley. He was 40 years old and had the look of someone who had been carrying something heavier than he had anticipated for longer than he had expected. He told Crane one thing and then he left. Crane stood in his back doorway for a long time after Thaddeus was gone, looking at the dark shape of the mountains against the darker sky. The thing Thaddeus had told him was, this Judge Stowe had known the pass road was going to fail before it failed. A hydraulic engineer Stowe had hired the previous summer to survey the water table on the ridge, the same survey that had confirmed the underground water source beneath Loretta Moreland's property had also examined the pass road and told Stowe directly in a written report dated August 4th that the road's foundation would not survive a wet autumn. The road needed shoring, it needed work that would cost money and time, and that Stowe had chosen not to commission. He had read the report, he had filed it, he had waited. He had calculated that a valley cut off from supply lines would be a valley where desperate people sold land at whatever price they were offered. He had calculated that the widow on the ridge, isolated and alone, would be the first to go. He had not calculated Loretta Moreland. Crane closed the back door and stood in his kitchen for a long time, and then he went to his desk and began to write down what he had just heard in the same careful hand he used for the weekly sermon, because some things need to be written down before they can be carried. On the ridge, Loretta was still awake. She was sitting at the table with the notebook open and the wax-sealed paper smoothed flat beside it, and she was calculating the 7 remaining weeks with the same precise attention she had given to every calculation since the spring of 1884. The smokehouse was gone. That changed the numbers. It did not make survival impossible. It made it harder, and harder had been the condition of her life for 4 years, and she had learned what harder required. She wrote the revised figures. She looked at the sealed paper again. She thought about Thaddeus Dunbar, who she did not know was at that moment sitting in Crane's kitchen, telling a story that would rewrite everything. She closed the notebook and put the pencil down and sat in the firelight for a while before going to bed. Outside, the Colorado winter held the valley in both hands, patient and indifferent, as it had always been waiting for the people inside their small, warm rooms to do what people do, which is either break or find the thing inside them that does not. The morning after Thaddeus Dunbar knocked on Crane's back door, the valley woke to silence. Not the silence of peace, the silence of a place holding its breath, the way air goes still in the seconds between lightning and thunder when everything alive understands that something large is about to move. The ice fog had lifted overnight, and for the first time in weeks, the sky was clear pale blue and cold and sharp, and the mountains stood out against it with a particular clarity that comes only in deep winter. Every ridgeline and shadow precise as an engraving. On the ridge, Loretta was already up when the first color came into the eastern sky. She had slept 4 hours, which was what she had been sleeping most nights since January, and she had woken with the specific, focused alertness of someone whose mind had continued working through the dark without her conscious direction and had arrived at something by morning. She stood on the porch with her coat on and her breath in the cold air, and she looked down at the valley below at the small lights coming on in the windows of Redstone Creek one by one, and she waited. She did not know yet about Thaddeus Dunbar. She knew about the sealed paper in her coat pocket, and she knew about the 7 weeks remaining, and she knew about the burned smokehouse and the revised calculations she had made through the night. She knew what she had, and she knew what she had lost, and she knew what was required between now and the first thaw. What she did not know was that 30 minutes earlier, Reverend Crane had sat down at his kitchen table and written out everything Thaddeus Dunbar had told him in 2 careful pages signed and dated, and had folded those pages into the inside pocket of his coat, where they would remain until he decided the moment was right to unfold them. The community meeting happened 3 days later on a Thursday afternoon. It was Crane who called it using the church bell in the way he used it for serious matters. 3 rings and a pause, and 3 rings again, which in Redstone Creek meant come now and do not stop to change your coat. By the time the bell finished, most of the valley's adults were moving toward the white clapboard building at the center of the main street, their breath visible, their faces carrying the guarded, watchful expression of people who have been afraid for a long time and have learned not to show it completely. Stowe was there. He came in after most of the others and took his usual seat in the front row, his dark suit immaculate, his posture the posture of a man who considers himself a fixed point around which other things arrange themselves. He looked at the gathering with the mild, patient expression he wore to public occasions, interested but not concerned, the expression of a man who believes he controls more variables than anyone else in the room. He was about to discover what a variable he had not accounted for looks like when it stands up. Thaddeus Dunbar came in last through the side door, and he did not sit down. He stood at the edge of the room near the wall with his hat in his hands, the same posture he had stood in at Crane's back door, and he looked at the floor. He was a thin man, and he looked thinner now, the way a person looks when they have been carrying something internal that has finally been set down, and the muscles are surprised by the absence of the weight. Crane opened the meeting the way he opened everything, with measured words and a steadiness of tone that came from 30 years of standing at the front of rooms containing people in difficult situations. He spoke about the winter, about what the valley had endured, about Prentice Tanner, whose name he said clearly and without softening, because Apprentice Tanner deserved to be named clearly in a room full of the people who had lived through the same season he had not survived. Then he said there are things this community needs to hear, and he nodded to Thaddeus Dunbar. Thaddeus looked up from the floor. He looked at Stowe, and Stowe looked back at him with the precise, still expression of a man who is calculating options at speed. Then Thaddeus looked away from Stowe, which was itself a declaration, and he began to speak. He did not speak for long. He had one thing to say, and he said it plainly without decoration. He told the room that Stowe had received a written report in August stating that the pass road would fail under heavy autumn rain. He told them Stowe had read it and done nothing. He told them why. The room was very quiet. Stowe stood up. He spoke in his measured, authoritative voice, the voice that had been effective for 20 years in rooms like this one, and he said that Thaddeus Dunbar was a disgruntled former employee making accusations without evidence, and that this was the kind of thing that happened when weak men were looking for someone to blame for circumstances beyond any individual's control. He was still speaking when Dr. Emmett Mercer stood up. Mercer did not raise his voice. He opened the notebook he had been carrying in his breast pocket since October, and he read from it slowly and without inflection because the facts did not require inflection. He read the date and the location and the physical details of Prentice Tanner's wound as he had examined it on the morning of January 15th. He read his assessment of the weapon type and the range and the trajectory. He read the names Harlan Voss and Wendell Voss and the dates on which he had previously treated both men and his notations regarding the inconsistency of their explanations at the time. Then Loretta Moreland walked in through the back door of the church. She had not been invited. She had come because Crane had sent Rockwell down the ridge at first light with a message that said simply Thursday afternoon, "Church, bring the paper." She walked to the front of the room without looking at the faces on either side of her because she had not come for their expressions. She had come for one specific purpose. She stopped at the table at the front of the room, the table where Crane stood, and she took the folded paper from her coat pocket and placed it on the table and smoothed it flat with both hands. The hand-drawn diagram of her cabin, the circled approach routes, the margin note in educated handwriting, and the wax seal in the lower right corner pressed clearly into the paper. The balance scales unmistakable to anyone who had ever seen a legal document from Judge Crispin Stowe's office. The room looked at the paper. Then the room looked at Stowe. Harriet Briggs had been sitting in the fourth row with her hands folded in her lap since the meeting began, and she had been listening with the particular attention of a woman who is assembling pieces she has been carrying separately. When the paper was laid on the table, she stood up and she did not ask permission to speak. "My daughter slept in that cabin for 2 months," she said. She looked at Stowe directly. "You sent men to shoot into it." Stowe's expression did not break, but something behind his eyes did a small, precise fracturing, the look of a man who understands that a room has turned in a way that cannot be turned back. He tried once more. He said that a piece of paper with a diagram on it proved nothing. He said that the seal could have been copied. He said that the accusations of a frightened community looking for someone to blame were not evidence and would not be treated as evidence in any legitimate court. Fletcher Aldous said from the middle of the room without standing up, without particular heat in his voice, "There is no court right now. You made sure of that." The silence after that was a different kind of silence from all the silences before it. It had weight and direction. Stowe looked around the room at the faces of people he had known for years, people he had lent money to and sold contracts to and maneuvered around and occasionally helped in the way powerful men help people when helping cost them nothing. He looked at those faces and saw in them the thing he had not been able to account for in his calculations, which was not rage and not fear and not the chaos of desperate people, but something much harder to work with: clarity. He picked up his hat from the seat beside him, and he walked to the back of the church and out the door. No one tried to stop him. No one called after him. The door closed with an ordinary sound, a latch catching, and the room stayed where it was and let him go. It was not theater. It was not triumph. It was simply the end of something. After the meeting, the Valley began to do what it had not known how to do since September. It began to work together, not all at once and not without the friction that comes when people who have been afraid together have to learn to be useful together instead. But the direction had changed, and once a direction changes genuinely, it does not tend to change back. Fletcher Aldous came up the ridge the morning after the meeting. He did not bring firewood, which was what the arrangement had always been. He came empty-handed, and he stood at the yard gate until Loretta came to the porch, and then he said what he had been carrying since October without quite knowing how to put it down. I laughed the loudest, he said. He was not looking for absolution. He said it the way a man states a fact about himself that he has decided to stop hiding from. I was the one in the store who always had the loudest thing to say. I had 3 children at your table for 2 months, and I brought firewood like it was a transaction. Loretta looked at him. She waited. He said, I can build a stone smokehouse. Proper foundation, proper mortar. I built the foundation on the Nesbitt barn 10 years ago, and it is still standing. I need you to tell me the dimensions you need, and I will do the rest. Loretta considered him for a moment. Then she said 16 feet by 12, opening on the south face. The vent channels along the top, she indicated the spacing with her hands that distance apart. He nodded. Anything else? She told him she needed it finished before the next hard freeze, which her reading of the weather suggested was 3 to 4 weeks away. He said he would have it done in 2. He was done in 10 days. The stone smokehouse that Fletcher Aldous built on the north side of Loretta Moreland's yard was a different thing from the one the Voss brothers had burned. The old one had been wood-framed with board siding, functional and adequate for one person's needs. The new one was stone from the foundation to the cap, mortared tight. The vent channels cut precisely into the upper walls at the intervals. Loretta had specified the door hung on iron hinges Fletcher had forged himself. It would not burn, it would not shift. It had the look of something that had always been there, that belonged to the land, rather than sitting on top of it. When it was done, Fletcher stood back and looked at it and said nothing. Loretta came out of the cabin and looked at it and said nothing. They stood side by side for a moment in the cold air, and then Loretta went back inside to begin the calculations for what the new storage capacity meant for the remaining weeks. The women of the valley came to the ridge in small groups through February, not to bring things, but to learn things, which was a different kind of coming and required a different kind of humility. Harriet Briggs came first, then Mara Nesbitt, then 4 others by the end of the first week. They sat in the cabin kitchen, and Loretta showed them what she knew with the same directness she showed everything, without condescension and without false modesty, simply as one person transferring useful information to another person who needed it. She showed them the specifics of salting meat for long storage, the ratio and the method, and the things that could go wrong if either was imprecise. She showed them how to read the surface of drying food for the signs of failure before it was too late to prevent loss. She showed them which root vegetables kept longest in what conditions and how to check a sealed jar for the signs of spoilage without opening it. They asked questions, real questions, the kind that come from genuine need rather than politeness. Loretta answered each one. She did not say, I told you this would be necessary, or any version of that sentence, because the sentence would have been true and it would have cost them something they needed to keep, which was the ability to go forward without being reminded at every step of where they had been. Ottilie sat in the corner of the kitchen during every one of these sessions and wrote in a small composition book she had asked Rockwell to bring her from the general store. She wrote in the careful, oversized handwriting of a child who is taking the thing she is writing down seriously. She wrote everything. Reverend Crane came to the ridge less often now, but with more purpose each time he came. He had stopped coming with the manner of a man performing a duty and had begun coming with the manner of a man who has discovered at 58 that there are things he does not know, and that the not knowing is something to move toward rather than away from. He and Loretta developed over those weeks a way of talking that was not quite friendship and not quite the relationship between a spiritual advisor and a member of his congregation. It was something more specific than either two people who had been on opposite sides of the same question and had arrived through separate paths at the same answer, and who found in that a kind of respect that did not require warmth to be genuine. He asked her once, standing in the yard on a gray February afternoon while the children worked inside, whether she had been angry at the valley, not at Stowe specifically, at the valley. She was quiet for a moment. She was looking at the new stone smokehouse and the ridge line beyond it. No, she said finally. He waited. You cannot be angry at people for not knowing what they have not yet learned, she said. You can only be ready for what happens when they do not know it and then teach them when the time comes. Crane looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, that is a harder position to hold than anger. She said, yes, it is. The first sign of spring came on a morning in early March. It was not dramatic. It was a sound, the sound of water moving in the creek at the bottom of the ridge, a sound that had been absent since November when the surface had sealed over and the world below it had slowed to near stillness. Loretta heard it from the porch before first light, a faint low murmur, tentative and new, the first word of a language she had been waiting months to hear again. She stood on the porch and listened to it for a long time. When the sun came up, she walked to the small patch of ground on the south side of the cabin, the patch that received the most direct light, and she knelt and pressed her fingers into the soil. Soft enough to move, not planted yet, not close enough to the last frost to risk seed, but changed. The ground had changed overnight from a thing that had been locked shut into a thing that was beginning to open. She stayed kneeling in the soil for a moment, the scar on her right palm pressed against the cold, wet earth. She felt the texture of it, the small give of it, the particular aliveness of soil that is waking up. And she held that feeling the way you hold something you were not sure you would see again. Then she stood up and went inside to get Rockwell. They planted that morning, not because the timing was perfect, it was still 2 weeks early by any sensible measure, but because the ground had said it was ready, and Loretta had spent 4 years learning to trust what the ground said. She and Rockwell worked the south patch together in the cold air, and before the morning was half over, they were not alone. Fletcher Aldous came up with his wife Sarah and their 3 boys who had spent 2 months in the cabin and were now home but still came up the ridge most days in the way that children return to the places where something important happened to them. The Aldous boys worked without being asked, without being managed, moving between the rows with the unconscious competence of children who have been watching work done correctly for a long time. The Nesbitt family came up in the afternoon. By the end of the day, there were 11 adults and 9 children working the ridge, and the conversation among them had the specific tone of people who are no longer afraid, which is not loud or celebratory but steady, the tone of people moving forward. The supply convoy from Denver arrived in the first week of April when the pass had been cleared enough for wagons to come through single file. The driver was a man named Sylvester Hadley, who ran supply routes through 4 mountain valleys and who had over 20 years developed a reliable internal sense of what a cut-off community looked like when it came back into contact with the outside world. He knew hunger. He knew the way a crowd moved when it had been without, for a long time, the particular forward lean of people who needed things urgently. He knew the faces of communities that had come through hard seasons and the faces of communities that had not. He drove the first wagon through the cleared section of the pass road and into the main street of Redstone Creek, and he stopped the horses and he looked around for a long moment without speaking. The main street was quiet. Not the quiet of abandonment, the quiet of a place in the middle of its ordinary day. 2 men were working on a building foundation at the far end of the street, the sound of their mallets steady and unhurried. A woman was hanging washing. 3 children ran across the street with the loose, purposeless energy of children who are not hungry. In front of Gideon's store, a line of full barrels stood ready to be moved, already organized, as though someone had known a delivery was coming and had prepared a space for it. Hadley climbed down from the wagon, and Gideon Falk came out to meet him. "We heard you were cut off from September," Hadley said. "The whole pass." Gideon said, "We were." Hadley looked at him. From September to April is 7 months. He had seen towns survive 2 months of isolation and come out of it broken. He said, "How?" Gideon was quiet for a moment. He looked up the ridge road toward the eastern hill. He said, "We were not entirely cut off." Hadley followed his eyes to the ridgeline where a thin line of smoke rose from a stone chimney above the tree line. One of the things Hadley would remember later and would mention when he told the story of Redstone Creek over the following years was that when he asked Gideon Falk to explain what had happened over the winter, Gideon did not begin with the landslide or the supply shortage or the weeks of isolation. He began with a woman drying apple slices on a rooftop in June while men on the street below laughed. The day Redstone Creek planted its fields was the warmest day the valley had seen since October. The sky was the particular blue of high-altitude spring, deep and clear and unmarked, and the mountains around the valley had lost their winter whiteness, except for the very highest reaches, which kept their snow year-round regardless of what the seasons below were doing. Loretta worked in her own garden through the morning and then walked down the ridge in the afternoon for the first time since the landslide. She had been down only twice since September, both times briefly for specific purposes. This was the first time she walked down slowly the way a person walks when they have nowhere urgent to be. The main street looked like a street again. The drained, frightened quality that had settled over it in October was gone. People moved through it with the particular ease of people who have survived something together and have not forgotten that they did it together. There was a new quality to the way they looked at each other when they passed, something between acknowledgement and recognition. The look of people who know things about each other that cannot be talked about directly but are present in every interaction. Loretta walked to the churchyard where Crane was repainting the porch rail after the winter damage. He saw her coming and set down the brush. He said, "There is something I want to tell you." She waited. He said, "The morning after Thaddeus Dunbar came to my door, I sat at my desk for 3 hours before I wrote down what he had told me. I sat there because I was trying to decide whether to believe it, not whether it was factually true. I could see that it was factually true. I was trying to decide whether I was willing to believe that a man I had known for 15 years, a man I had sat with in this church every Sunday, had done what Thaddeus said he had done. Whether I was willing to let the evidence change what I thought I knew." He paused. He picked up the paintbrush and put it down again. "I want you to know that I sat there 3 hours," he said. "I am not proud of the 3 hours, but I wrote it down in the end." Loretta looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "3 hours is not so long." He looked at her. "You were certain about me all summer," she said. "It took an act of God and a landslide and a dead child before that changed. 3 hours for Thaddeus Dunbar's words to become real to you seems to me like rather good time." It was the closest she came across the entire winter to saying what she could have said. And she said it without bitterness, which was the thing that surprised him most, because she had earned the right to bitterness and had chosen not to carry it. Crane picked up the paintbrush again. He said, "I would like to use what happened this winter as a teaching for the congregation. Not using names, not pointing at anyone, just the principle of it." Loretta said, "What principle do you have in mind?" He considered. "The principle that preparation and faith are not opposites, that attention to the material world is not evidence of spiritual failure." He paused. "That sometimes God sends the neighbor instead of the miracle, and the only thing required of us is not to laugh at them." Loretta was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is a reasonable sermon." She walked back up the ridge in the late afternoon light, the long mountain shadows already reaching across the valley floor. The drying racks she had seen installed in front of 2 houses on the main street caught her eye as she passed new-built and not yet used standing in the front yards, like intentions made physical. When she reached the cabin, Rockwell was on the porch sitting on the step, with his elbows on his knees looking out at the valley below, with the expression he sometimes had in the evenings. Now not sad exactly, not searching, but the expression of a young man who is letting himself inhabit the fact of being alive in a particular place and finding slowly that the place is sufficient. He had grown 4 inches since September. He had the hands of a man now and still the face of someone deciding what kind of man to be. He said, "How was the valley?" She said, "It is planting." He nodded. Then he said, I heard from Dewey Nesbitt that Stowe left the territory, went east somewhere. No one knows exactly. Loretta said, that is about right. She went inside. She came back out a few minutes later with 2 mugs of tea and sat down on the step beside him, which she did not often do. They drank the tea in silence, looking at the valley below with the long shadows moving across it. After a while, Rockwell said, what happens now? Loretta looked at the valley. Smoke from evening fires was beginning to rise from the chimneys below. The new stone smokehouse behind the cabin caught the last of the sunlight on its western face. Somewhere down the hill, she could hear children running, the high, uncomplicated sound of children who are not afraid. She said the same thing that always happens. Summer comes, we work, then winter comes again. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, and we are ready. She did not answer right away. She looked at the drying racks visible through the trees, at the filled root cellar, at the careful stacks of firewood under the covered lean-to that Fletcher had helped build along the east wall. She looked at the notebook on the table inside, visible through the open door, open to its current page of figures. She thought of Prentice Tanner in his grave behind the cabin. She thought of Alonzo and DeWitt and Jasper in their graves beside him, the 4 mounds side by side under the open sky marked with flat stones she had chosen and set herself. She thought about the winter that had taken everything from her once, and the winter that had tried a second time and found her standing. She said, we are more ready than we were. Then she said, that is all anyone can ever say, and it is enough. The light went slowly from the sky in the long way of spring evenings at high altitude, the horizon holding color long after the sun was gone, the mountains standing in clear silhouette against it, immense and permanent and indifferent, in the way that mountains are, which is not cruelty and not kindness, but simply the nature of things that have existed far longer than the people in the valley below and will continue to exist long after. Loretta sat on the step until the color left the sky entirely. She did not move to go inside. She sat in the dark with her hands around the empty mug, and the scar on her right palm rested against the warm ceramic. And she looked at the first stars coming out above the ridgeline. The same stars that had been above this valley on the night she had buried 3 people in frozen ground and made a promise she had not known how to keep. She had kept it the only way it could be kept, not by preventing loss, not by making the world safe, but by being the thing that stood between those she was responsible for and the worst that winter could do again and again through every form it took until spring came. Spring had come. Below her, Redstone Creek was going to sleep with full root cellars and properly salted meat in stone smokehouses, and notebooks where women had written down what they had learned. Children who had spent a winter on the ridge would grow up and have children of their own and tell the story differently each time, the details shifting and simplifying over decades until what remained was the essence of it, the woman who had been laughed at and had prepared anyway, the winter that had tried to break a valley and found one woman in its way who would not move. Loretta did not think about any of that. She was not a person who spent time on the version of herself that history might build. She was a person who looked at what the next season required and worked toward it with everything she had. What the next season required was seed selection by variety, a calculation she had already begun, and an expansion of the garden's south-facing section by approximately 30 feet to account for the additional mouths she anticipated needing to supply in the coming winter. In a conversation with Dr. Mercer about establishing a small medical supply cache on the ridge that could be accessed without descending to the valley in heavy weather. She was already thinking about these things when the door behind her opened and Ottilie Briggs came out with her composition book under her arm and sat down on the step beside her close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Ottilie said nothing for a while. She had learned in 4 months at the cabin the value of not filling silence with sound. She sat and looked at the same dark valley Loretta was looking at, and the composition book stayed closed on her knee. After a while, she said, I wrote down everything from today. Loretta said, good. Ottilie held the composition book in her lap with both hands. It was nearly full, the pages thick, with the careful handwriting of a child who had spent a winter watching how things were done and understanding in some ways she could not yet articulate, but could feel with certainty that the knowing of how things were done was the difference between surviving and not surviving, and that it therefore deserved to be written down carefully and kept. Ottilie said, "When I am older, I am going to teach it." Loretta looked at her. The girl was looking at the stars, not at Loretta, saying the thing the way children say their true intentions, simply and without negotiation, as a statement of what is and not what might be. Loretta said, "What will you teach?" Ottilie thought about it. She said, "What you taught me, how to look at things, how to pay attention to what the ground is saying and what the birds are doing and what the wind feels like when it is wrong." She paused. "And how to be ready before you need to be." The last of the day's warmth was leaving the porch step. The night sounds of the mountain were settling in the specific quiet of a spring night at elevation, full of small sounds rather than empty of them. Loretta looked at the composition book in Ottilie's hands, the brown cover worn at the corners already. The pages swelled slightly with the fullness of what had been written in them. She had been given a brown leather notebook by Alonzo the spring before the bad winter. A small, practical gift from a man who understood her and knew she would fill it. She had filled it and then filled another and then another, and the record she had kept in them was the record of 4 years of learning everything that the winter of 1883 had proven she did not know, written down in the only way knowledge survives, one careful page at a time. She pressed her right palm flat against the step beneath her, feeling the grain of the wood, the specific solidity of something built to last. She said, "Then teach it." Ottilie nodded. She opened the composition book to a fresh page and wrote the date at the top of it in her large, careful hand. She wrote, "Spring came." She thought for a moment. Then she wrote, "We are still here." The fire in the cabin burned through the night as it had burned through every night of the winter that was ending. On the ridge above Redstone Creek Valley, in the stone and timber structure that had held 14 children and a 16-year-old boy, and a woman who had decided that the cold would not win again, the light in the window was the last light to go out in the valley each night and the first to come on each morning. It would be that way again next winter and the winter after, not because the mountain had changed, not because the cold had learned mercy, but because one person had paid attention and everyone else was looking the other way, had prepared while others laughed, had held on through the darkest part of the season until the people around her had learned to hold on too, and had asked for nothing in return except that they remember what they had learned and pass it forward. The stars turned above the ridge. The creek moved in the dark below, running clear and cold over stones. It had been running over for 10,000 years before the first cabin was built on this hillside, and would run over for 10,000 years after the last one was gone. The valley slept. Loretta Moreland did not sleep yet. She sat a while longer on the step in the dark, in the good company of silence and stars and the girl beside her, and she let the spring night be what it was. It was enough. It was, after everything, more than enough.